Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stauffer of Religions for Peace USA, and I want to welcome you again to our monthly webinar series, which is Where Religions Come Together. Today we're going to speak with author and interfaith activist leader Susan Katz, who's the author of Being Both, Engaging Two Religions in One Interfaith Family. I'm really excited about our conversation today. And the respondent is Master's of Divinity student Samantha Gonzalez-Block. She's a seminary intern at First Presbyterian Church in Brooklyn, and is in the middle of her Master's of Divinity degree at Union Theological Seminary. She comes from an interfaith family and is interfaith herself, and has taught classes on occasion for the interfaith community in New York City, which was an organization profiled in Being Both, Susan's book. Again, Religions for Peace USA strives to really provide you with a chance to engage and be educated about what are the primary topics and the foremost important events and things going on in the interfaith movement and the interfaith community today. I'm excited about this sort of conversation because it brings up to the fore a lot of primary questions on what does it mean for the interfaith movement to be questioning the very notion of religious affiliation, and then also how that even siphons itself down to interfaith families. These are challenges that all of us in the interfaith movement will be facing, especially interfaith organizations working for peace and justice, like Religions for Peace USA. So really, I'm excited about this conversation again, and I'll just turn it right over to Susan, and we'll jump right in.
Thank you for having me. So I'm a member of a happy three-generation interfaith family. My parents are in their 80s now. My children are in their teens and 20s. And my family includes Jews, Catholics, and Protestants, believers, seekers, humanists. I'm Jewish, but my interfaith identity is also important to me. And academics in recent years have been writing and thinking a lot about people who have complex religious identity. That's me, but when I think about it, I think, doesn't everybody have a complex religious identity? I mean, none of us can really be totally encompassed by a single word religious label. That's kind of the way I think about it. My father, who's Jewish, met my mother, who's Protestant, in 1953. So they were at the beginning of this big wave of interfaith marriage in the Jewish community. And they married in 1960. I was born a year later. And they decided to raise Jewish children. They did what most religious institutions, most clergy were urging families to do, which is to choose one religion. 50 years later, more than 50 years later, they still have one of the best, strongest, happiest marriages I know. So choosing one religion for our family was a great choice. It worked really well. It works well for a lot of families, but not for all interfaith families. And in the research for my book, what I really tried to do was to set out the idea that no matter what pathway you choose in an interfaith family, whether you choose one religion or the other religion or both religions or no religions or all religions or maybe a third religion, a new religion, each of those pathways is going to have very specific benefits and specific drawbacks, specific challenges. None of those pathways is going to really solve the interfaithness of the family or make it go away. So I think that that is something to celebrate. I don't see the interfaithness of a family as being a problem. I see it as something that can be inspirational and be a source of creativity and a source of joy, because that's the way it's been for my family. Now, I mentioned that my parents chose one religion. My husband and I got married more than 25 years ago now, and he is Protestant, he's Episcopalian. We had a rabbi and a minister at our wedding, and 3 days later we moved to Africa. We spent 3 years there, and I would describe myself as a nice Jewish girl married to a Protestant working for a Catholic organization in a Muslim country. And by the end of our years there, we were celebrating Jewish holidays, Christian holidays, and Muslim holidays with our Senegalese friends and neighbors. A little bit later, we went and spent 3 years in northeastern Brazil. And there we were immersed in Catholic social teaching, liberation theology, but also a lot of Afro-Brazilian religious rites and practices that are based on the Yoruba culture of West Africa. So again, we saw a lot of Brazilians who were double belonging, who were practicing Catholicism and practicing these Yoruba-based religious cultural practices, and they didn't see any conflict in that. And I really came to realize that interfaith marriage has been with us since the beginning of religion. And it permeates a lot of our culture, but we rarely talk about it. Certainly, if you read the Bible, there's interfaith marriages constantly, but we don't talk about that. If you travel elsewhere in the world, there are a lot of countries where people have this double belonging. They have different religions that they're using for different parts of their lives, and they don't see this as a big conflict. So my husband and I made the decision to raise our children with both family religions, Judaism and Christianity. And for this book, I wanted to go beyond memoir, so I did a chronicle of a grassroots movement in America right now, because what's happened is families that decide to do both are coming together and coalescing and forming community to support each other in doing this. Because traditionally religious institutions have not encouraged you to do this, the families have formed their own communities. And right now in New York, Chicago, and Washington, there are major communities where you have more than 100 interfaith children all getting an interfaith education together in classrooms that typically will have a Jewish educator and a Christian educator working together, so that the kids are learning the common ground of the two family religions, but also the important differences and the history of how those two religions have been interwoven over time. And those aren't things that you will easily get in a single faith religious education classroom. You know, it's interesting, in the UK, government-funded schools are required to do interfaith education. All kids get religious education, and if it's a Catholic school with government funding, for instance, they do primarily Catholic education, but then they also learn about the other religions. And the same is true in any government-funded school. Now, here in the U.S., because of the separation of church and state, which I understand and which has benefit, one of the results of that is that we have no religious education in our public schools, with the possible exception of maybe a class in high school that some kids might take if they, have time in their schedule. So in America, kids really grow up very ignorant of other religions. The only religion that they learn is whatever their parents deliver to them through usually a specific house of worship. So it would be a very narrow education in one religion. And you could, and I do, make the argument that all children would benefit from interfaith education, but especially those from interfaith families, because I believe it's important to understand your ancestry, your extended family, even if the family chooses one religious label for their children. So for the book, I was looking for data on children raised with more than one religion, and there wasn't any, because no one has really studied this yet, and I hope that that's going to change now. But I went out and I did my own surveys. It's qualitative data, but I surveyed 250 parents who had put their children into these interfaith education programs, and 50 young adults and teens who had been through those programs. With the parents, one of the primary questions I asked them was, why are you doing this? You've got institutions telling you not to do it, a lot of clergy telling you not to do it. The primary reason most parents gave was that they really just wanted their children to be literate in both religions, to be bilingual, if you will, in two religious languages. So that even if both parents were quite secular, which was true in some cases, they still wanted their children to understand references to Bible in literature, in culture, in politics, and in other cases, both parents are quite religious. They're religious practitioners, and they wanted the child to have exposure to both, so that if and when they make a decision to choose one religion or the other, at least they have some background. For instance, in the Washington, D.C. program, which is called the Interfaith Families Project, in which my kids grew up, our classrooms now start Hebrew in pre-K, so that the kids get that Hebrew literacy, so that if and when they want to have a bar or bat mitzvah, which you can do at any age, it doesn't have to be at 13, at least they'll have that literacy and they won't have to start from scratch. So the book primarily focuses on Judaism and Christianity. I guess that's clear by now. That's because that was my experience, and it's also because these intentional interfaith education programs for interfaith children have primarily been focused on those two religions, because that's been the demographics. But I do have a chapter in my book filled with stories of Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, other interfaith couples who are all intending or raising their children with both of whatever their two religions are. And I'm really hoping that other people will now write books about what it's like to be in those interfaith families and the decisions that they've made for their children. When I looked at the young people, when I surveyed them, when I interviewed them, 90%, something like 90% of them said that their parents had made a good decision to raise them with an interfaith education. So I think that that is testimony to the idea that they weren't upset by this education, that they found it valuable. And close to 90% of them said that they were not confused by it. That has been a traditional concern, that if they learned more than one system simultaneously, that the children would be confused. And often what they say is, you know, the people who ask me about it are confused. I'm not confused. The confusion is on the part of the beholder, and not for the kids who grew up with it. It's actually quite natural. One of the ministers that I interviewed who had worked with these programs, and I had a whole chapter filled with the profiles of rabbis, ministers, priests who have worked with these interfaith families. But one of the ministers said to me that actually children are better able to learn two religions, just like they are better able to learn two languages, that their brains are more flexible and more fluid. And as you get older, it becomes more difficult to accommodate that. So that was kind of interesting. Ultimately, what we're teaching our children in these programs is that the burden of figuring out how you want to be religiously identified, where you want to affiliate, what spiritual tools are useful to you, is a human condition. It's something that all of us have to go through. Even if you come from a single faith background, you still have to make those choices, even if they're default choices to stick with what you were brought up with. So it's not that we place this terrible burden on the shoulders of poor little interfaith children that they have to make these choices. All of us are making these choices. And if you look at Pew Research data on religious flexibility and fluidity in America, you see this tremendously high rate of switching affiliations, leaving, coming back, double belonging. All of this is going on, and not just within interfaith families. I really feel that in the 21st century, whether we're talking about race, culture, sexual orientation, gender, religion, any of these categories, those binaries are breaking down. A lot of us are creating complex identities. We are claiming those both and identities and really moving away from that black or white, this or that only kind of identities. And especially millennials, because they're growing up interconnected globally with much more contact with the incredible diversity of the world, they're comfortable with this kind of fluidity and flexibility in a way that their parents' generation may not be. finally, I want to say that I believe that people from interfaith families, and especially interfaith children, because we are living with interfaith communication, interfaith education on a daily 24/7 basis, that we really have developed skills in interfaith dialogue and interfaith activism. And that I really am hoping to see people from interfaith families playing a bigger role in interfaith dialogue and interfaith activism, because I think in the past, sometimes people with complex religious identities or from interfaith families have been excluded from that dialogue because the ambiguity makes people uncomfortable. But the reality is that more and more of us fall into this complex category, and I do think that we have a background that really predisposes us to that kind of bridge building, peacemaking. Each of us is an interfaith ambassador by default because we have to explain to the world who we are, who our parents are, and how it is that we claim a religion or another religion or both or none or why. People are curious, and so you end up explaining your religions and how they fit together and the history. And all of that, I think, makes us able to really help with this process and hopefully to decrease religious misunderstanding and to reduce the amount of intolerance that is there in the world. That's it.
Well, thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you so much, Susan.
It's wonderful. Do you mind if Sam, I just wanna jump in here, particularly because I want to highlight the last thing you said, that Religions for Peace USA hits a big challenge, which is the fact that as we are looking at the changing of the religious landscape and seeing these statistics that Pew has brought up over and over again, 30% of the people under 30 are nuns and nons, or atheists or agnostic. The question is that how organizations like Religions for Peace USA or nonprofit organizations or even religious institutions on the ground go about engaging in and working with some of these challenges that you raise up. What in your interviews, what resources did these institutions, what are they developing to respond to that?
Well, it varies a lot depending on the religion. If you're a minority religion in America, you've probably spent time thinking about this issue because, you know, interfaith marriage is seen as a demographic threat, and there's a fear about assimilation, and so there has been a fair amount written to try to discourage interfaith marriage, discourage interfaith families, discourage double belonging. From a Christian point of view, the majority view, it really hasn't been an issue because it hasn't been a demographic threat. The people who are intermarried just sort of get absorbed, or they're such a minority statistically that it hasn't been seen as a problem. And so there's been a sort of luxury of ignoring it until recently. Now I think what we're seeing with Pew is the tremendous number of people who are leaving religious life, leaving houses of worship, ending their affiliations. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But people who intermarry certainly can become alienated from religious institutions if they feel they're not welcomed. So there's a feedback loop there where you lose people because they feel alienated, and they feel alienated, then they certainly feel more free to intermarry.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, I apologize about jumping in there. Definitely, let's turn to you, and I want to hear some of your response, please.
Thanks so much. And Susan, first of all, I want to say how much I appreciated reading your book, because I grew up in an interfaith home, and we didn't have a lot of texts like this that could really speak to our story. And so your book really spoke to me. So to give you just a brief sort of background, I grew up in a Jewish Christian home with a father who was Jewish and a mother who was Christian. And at the time, we didn't really have any organization like Interfaith Community or Interfaith Families Project to kind of guide us on our way. So my parents really kind of made it up as they went along. And initially, my mother took us to church, and we went to church with her, and we would celebrate the Jewish holidays sort of at home. And then when I hit about middle school, my father began to attend temple. So then all of a sudden we were attending church and temple. And honestly, it was a really rich time for me because I was suddenly having the opportunity to explore both of my faiths. And at the same time, I felt a little bit disconnected from my Judaism because I hadn't sort of gotten that from the beginning. You know, I hadn't gone to Hebrew school and didn't have that community, and I wasn't preparing for a bat mitzvah like a lot of my friends. So I went ahead and had a confirmation at the church, and again, it was a process that I really had to think deeply about. And after having that confirmation, I really felt moved then to go ahead and really kind of dive into my Judaism and study that as well. So I became a religion major when I went to Barnard College and studied Judaism, and then afterward went on Birthright to Israel. And then and Birthright was a really interesting organization for me because it was really the first sort of Jewish organization outside of the sort of the clergy allies that we had in the past that really sort of acknowledged my Judaism and said, hey, your father is Jewish, but you are Jewish too. And so that was really meaningful for me, and I went ahead and had a bat mitzvah through Birthright when I got back from Israel. And it was really an interesting experience because I didn't tell anybody I was having this bat mitzvah. It was something that I was doing because I needed it for my faith. I was thinking it was something that was missing, and it was kind of the completeness. So I had it on my own. I didn't even tell my parents. I was sort of like Yentl. I was studying at night. But then I let them know that I said, well, I'm having a bat mitzvah in 2 weeks. I would love for you to come, and they did. And so it was a really kind of interesting experience to have had that coming of age ceremony later. And it was through that process, again, that I felt called, as we say in the religious world, to go into the ministry and really become a member of the clergy who could really be an advocate and an ally to interfaith families. And so right now I'm studying to be a Presbyterian minister and feel kind of like what you said, sort of wholly Christian and wholly Jewish, and really hold that up. One, for me, cannot exist without the other. And I know for a lot of people it's a very strange thing to be, kind of a really strange place, kind of it's not exactly in the box there, but I say, I know no other way. I wouldn't be where I was had I not been born into an interfaith home and had been nurtured in that way. So I just, first of all, just want to say thank you for your book, because I was underlining so many things because I was saying, yes, that's what I feel, and so that was very meaningful. So I had a question for you, and it's a question that I get a lot, and I would just sort of love to hear your thoughts about it, especially because you're involved with Interfaith Families Project. And I've had the opportunity to work with Interfaith Community, so I know there's some overlap there. It's really been very, very meaningful. But the question that I often get is, well, if you have an interfaith sort of education, isn't that just a watered down version of Judaism and Christianity? Isn't that like the kumbaya, Sunday school? And I would just love to hear your thoughts about, what is an interfaith education, and why is that meaningful?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things. Thank you so much for reading the book. And it's wonderful to hear your very positive story because, as I mentioned, my story was positive, but I didn't see that story reflected in the literature. Most of the previous books about interfaith marriage had been so negative, and even some of the current ones are so negative. And they're missing something. They're missing the joy. And this relates to your question, because I think when people say, well, it's just a watered-down version of two things, they're missing the fact that something gets added in. When you do both side by side, there's a synergy. You're not just doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that and missing a lot of stuff. You're doing some of this and some of that, and it creates something that is really spiritually fulfilling for me as an interfaith child. When I sit in a room of 100 other interfaith families and we're singing It could be a Jewish song, it could be a Christian song. But the fact that we're together gives me that spiritual fulfillment on this other level that people don't really understand unless they come from an interfaith family. In terms of how much content can you deliver to kids in the course of a year, yes, there's a reality that the more religions you teach, the less there's going to be of each religion. And that's why, for instance, we have not broadened out to include Islam, even though we sometimes are approached by Muslim, Christian, Muslim, Jewish families that say, help us. There's nowhere else for us to go. We have no home. And we say, you're welcome. Please come join us. But we can't teach 3 religions right now because we're already trying to teach 2 in a limited amount of time. And if you want to get, say, a curriculum that has all religions, there are places you can get that. For instance, Unitarian Universalism has a great interfaith curriculum. And that has value for itself, but for specifically Jewish and Christian interfaith families, what we're doing is trying to go as deep as we can into the 2 religions that are represented in your family. And that has specific meaning for those kids. And yes, if you compare it to, say, going to a Jewish day school and Hebrew school 3 times a week, you're not going to get the same amount of content in Judaism, for instance. But there are a lot of Christian or Jewish families who are not intentionally educating their children to the degree that we are. So I guess I would say my kids know more about Judaism than a lot of their friends who have 2 Jewish parents who are, say, High Holy Day Jews and don't really spend a lot of time in their family on faith education for whatever reason. And, you know, that's a good choice too if they're secular humanists and those are their values and it's not important to them and other things are important. That's fine. It works for your family, then it works. But we also see, and you mentioned this in your story, a lot of kids raised with this interfaith education go on to study more in college. They are hungry. They are curious about religion. And I think that's because they've been given this very open and in some ways very intellectual approach to religion. And it makes them want to go on and study Buddhism or deepen their knowledge of Judaism in college or their knowledge of Christianity. And I think that's a common theme with these kids.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I mean, I think that the importance of providing interfaith families with that kind of formalized education is really giving them, I love that word that you said, bilingual, you know, or giving them that ability to articulate their faith. Because I think when they choose to say, you know what, there's no place for us to go, we're going to step back, all of a sudden the children are growing up without the ability to even have a conversation, and they don't know which questions to ask. So I think it's really providing that space where they can, exactly what you're saying, just go ahead and be able to explain their faith and where it is, and even if it's in this mysterious space, that's okay. You know, they know that that's okay. So I also was wondering, I mean, you mentioned Unitarianism. I wonder for the families that don't live in New York or D.C. where these organizations are available. I know, you know, for my own family, we didn't have that real community, which now that I know that it exists, I wish we had.
Right.
But I wonder what advice you have for those families that are living in areas maybe that there's no formalized, you know, interfaith community or interfaith families project available.
Well, the first thing I tell people is if you build it, they will come. So form a community, even if it's just 2 or 3 other families and you get together for a Shabbat or you get together for a Christmas party, whatever it is, having that support from other families in a safe and neutral setting where you're not feeling pressure to choose, I think is really important. And some of the groups that have formed have evolved out of those small get-together of families that would happen, and then they might start celebrating holidays together, and then it sort of turns into a one-room schoolhouse, and then it can grow from there. That said, it takes a fair amount of, you know, organization and intentionality to make that happen, and if you don't have that kind of time or space and you just aren't going to do that, then yes, I tell people look for a welcoming community, and that could be UU, it could be secular humanist, it could be a progressive church, it could be a progressive synagogue. I mean, the wonderful thing is that a lot of religious communities have become more welcoming to interfaith families since the time my parents got married. When my parents got married, they really didn't have a lot of choice other than to choose a religion or to do nothing. Now you have all these choices, and even if you choose a religion, you can find a community that's going to say, understand that your family is going to have a Christmas tree, even if they're Jewish, and they're not going to take you to task for that. There's more understanding of the role that the other parent can and should play, even in a family that chooses a single religion. So I wanted to refer back to something you were saying. I think it's the idea, and other people have said that every marriage is an interfaith marriage because no two people share identical beliefs and practices. So even if two people are both, say, Presbyterians, they could have very different beliefs about the role of women in the church, or, you know, who Jesus really was to them. And what we teach our children is that you can't make assumptions about what anybody believes or practices based on their religious label. You really have to interact with that person to understand how they feel.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I know even growing up in an interfaith home and growing up in a multicultural home, all of those sort of questions are always sort of arising, and all of those cultural and religious differences are always there. But I think it makes you a more open-minded person, right?
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you too. I know that you were mentioning that, you know, religious houses of worship and people are becoming sort of more open-minded about the possibility of a tree and a menorah in the window. And I would say yes, but I would say there's also still so much pushback. I mean, I've even felt it in seminary. I've felt it, you know, in my own home, you know, congregations sometimes, you know, really just people not being able to understand, or even clergy members, you know, rabbis or ministers who are asking, but how can that be? And so I just wonder, you know, any advice that you might have for a clergy member who's sort of out there and, you know, either in seminary like me or has a congregation, you know, what do you do with these interfaith families, or how can you really be an ally and a support? Because I've experienced rabbis who've said, yeah, that's totally great that you're an interfaith family. Let me know if you want to become Jewish and you can attend our Hebrew school, you know. And I'm to say, well, I also attend my church, you know. And, well, let me know which one that you want to, you know, go with. And so I just wonder what sort of advice you might have for clergy who are saying, you know, I want to kind of explore this a little more. How can I be an ally?
Well, first of all, thank you for being on the front line as somebody who's, you know, has a divinity degree and is working as somebody who has a theological background in education. Because traditionally, I think, first of all, there's been a lot of confusion between doing both and doing nothing. And people who were trying to do both have been dismissed as not serious, as watered down, as doing nothing. And that's partly because people didn't have support from religious institutions, and so they were kind of stuck doing nothing a lot of times. What I find really encouraging is the chapter that I have with interviews with these rabbis, ministers, and priests who are working with these families. And they understand what it is that's valuable, why people are choosing to do this in spite of all the pushback, that there is this value that we find in it. And I think also historically there has been this idea that theologians, clergy could dump along because they're doing it in a very educated way, but that the people on the ground, the masses, really have to choose one or the other because they sort of don't have theological background to really know what they're doing, or that it's somehow irresponsible or theologically immature to do both. And yet, for me, it's interesting because I was raised with one religion and I sort of moved into claiming my interfaithness. I see my interfaithness as my mature stage coming out of a single religion background. So sometimes I do think we're kind of going like this. But, you know, the pressure to choose one, part of that is really out of a place of fear over the demographics, fear that people are leaving religious institutions, which they are, and struggling with that. And I think we have to work through fear to claiming joy. I mean, it's sounding kind of corny, but
I love it. Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I mean, I had an exchange with a rabbi once who said, "You're from an interfaith family. That must be such a challenge." And I said, "Well, actually, I think it was a blessing. You know, I really, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that." So it's really, I love the idea of sort of changing the language, or to kind of open that space up. And I wonder, you having raised your children in an interfaith kind of, or with an interfaith sort of support system, do you think it's essential for churches and synagogues to, or for families who are, let's say, involved in Interfaith Families Project to also have a church and a synagogue that's affiliated, or are we really talking about a new way or a new religion? I don't know. I'm wondering if people, who are watching are trying to understand, what it is that maybe is most needed.
Yes, because there are different models. As you know, in the Chicago program, families are really encouraged to, and they're Catholic and Jewish in that group, and they go to Mass, they belong to a synagogue, and their children go to the interfaith education program for their Sunday school, and the parents have the support. So they're almost like triple belonging in that case. Our group in Washington, because we have both a rabbi and a minister on staff, and we are providing a full High Holy Days program, Easter service, Christmas service, there are a lot of families who come only to the Interfaith Families Project and don't go to church and synagogue as much. They probably go with extended family. I think it's important that children experience churches and synagogues and see what the difference is, and go with family. One of our goals in our program, and I think in the other programs as well, is for the children to feel comfortable in a church setting and comfortable in a synagogue setting, because they will have a familiarity with the rituals, with the language, and because they won't find any of the imagery sort of scary. I mean, if you grow up in, at least for me, growing up in the 60s in a Jewish context, Jesus was not ever mentioned. And it was almost like you weren't supposed to even say that word. So we don't want our children to grow up feeling that way. We want them to be able to talk about all of the various ways of thinking about Jesus, for instance, whether it's as a historical figure or as a rabbi, as a teacher, as a character in a story, as the Son of God, whatever that means, whatever Son means, whatever God means, and for them to understand that all of these various beliefs are available to them. And again, that they will grow up and decide what they think. I sort of went off on the Jesus tangent there, but I think it's important to bring up, because usually when I speak in a group, that question is always there, and when somebody asks it, other people start nodding. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I love that you sort of mentioned in your book just that it's okay that that they're kind of on that process of discovery, and they don't necessarily know how the Jesus equals Son of God. You're giving them the space to really think about it and explore, and like you said earlier, they're okay with the ambiguity. We're probably more nervous. The parents or the clergy, or the people outside are a little bit more nervous. So I'm thinking, listening to you speak right now, I'm thinking that it also is important that the parents feel comfortable in a church, synagogue, or talking about these things with their kids too.
Yes, because I think it's important that partners are able to practice religion if they're going to practice it and to feel spiritual together. And if that means probably doing all of these things, that the Christian partner needs to feel comfortable going with the Jewish partner to synagogue, even if it's only when they're visiting their in-laws or going to cousins' bar mitzvahs or whatever that is. And that comfort level is only going to come with a certain amount of education and a certain amount of communication. Recently I did a talk on interfaith dating at a college campus, and that was a topic that they requested, and there was really this pent-up demand to talk about it, and I realized nobody's talking to them about it. But I started out by saying, all of the keys to successful interfaith dating are the same keys to any kind of dating, which is communicate, communicate, communicate. But it's all the more important when you're interfaith. And you have to teach your partner, you have to teach yourself, you have to educate yourself about your religious ancestry. If it's something that your parents didn't teach you, it's important to explore those roots, because you're going to be called on to explain them to, say, your partner's family. And so I even recommend reading, like, Judaism for Dummies. If that's where you have to start, that's better than nowhere. There's tremendous resources available for any religion. Religious institutions help people to understand their own religions, and you can use those resources. And college campuses are great because usually you have the different chaplains available, you have all kinds of programming, you have religious studies courses, you have this sort of feast where you can explore.
Yeah, I'm thinking about just in my own story, and my father would attend church. He would come for, the Christmas pageant or, kind of for those big moments. And my mother would come to temple with my dad also for those high holy days. But I remember I'm thinking about, every time I go and preach down at First Presbyterian Church Brooklyn where I'm serving, and I look out, I'm looking for my mom and my dad there, and they are, and that's a big thing, and I don't know if this ordination process would, feel as right if it wasn't, mom and dad kind of supporting in that process. So I think it's important that parents are there to have those conversations and also can really be supportive of whatever their children choose to do or to believe, or are there to kind of journey with them and not say, oh, you're on the other side or on my side, So I think it takes a lot of, like you're saying, communication, negotiation, a compromise, and all that, and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
Aaron, I know that I'm talking a lot too. I don't know if you have any
No,
questions. So I'm sorry, Susan.
Go ahead.
I think one thing that keeps on sort of recurring to me is that I think that the challenge for the interfaith movement itself and for sort of interfaith peacemaking is always to engage those who are already sort of predisposed by their temperaments or just sort of religious perspective to not engage with you on these sort of terms. And I think a quick and easy, although sort of crude way to put it would say, how do you approach conservative values about these sort of about these topics? In order to really say, these are people who are deeply invested in their single tradition, also have a role to play in this work. Primarily, it seems to me, because if you look at each religious tradition, you see at the heart of it, each tradition is teaching the religious other. And I think that is absolutely important when we're approaching these sort of topics, to sort of say there is, approaching an exclusivist outlook limits our ability to delve deeper into our own spirituality and into our own religious tradition. And I wonder, Susan, if you've, because I think that in sort of the New York community, things like this and these topics are more easily broached, primarily because you live in a more diverse, both demographically, ethnically, and religiously, community. How do you engage those who are fully based in their single religious tradition, and one, affirm it as a good thing, or if you don't, then let me know. But then on the other half, though, too, also help them to see that interfaith education, as you sort of use, and as sort of interfaith marriage and interfaith families, are a joy, something to be celebrated. Because it seems to me that you can do this, and that is the part of those who are based in their own religious tradition, to really help to celebrate the fullness of the religious plurality of America, which already is. I mean, this is part of the lingo too, is that religious pluralism is an accomplishment. No, it's a fact too, is that we live in the most religiously diverse nation in the world, and what this means for people at their family tables is directly the conversation I think you two are having, and I think it's wonderful. So I'm not. That was just sort of one of the questions that was appearing to me as I was listening to you to share your breadth of experience about this.
Well, you know, the statistics are hard to really come by, but there's somewhere between 25% and 40-something% of American marriages are now interfaith, and it depends on how you define that. You know, do you mean a Presbyterian married to a Baptist, or do you only mean a Muslim married to a Hindu in terms of the differences? So, but even if it's only 25%, that means that anybody, if they look at their extended family, it's going to be very hard to find somebody who doesn't have an uncle or an aunt or a cousin or a child or a grandchild who's going to be intermarried. And so I really think it's hard to kind of not engage with this topic and just sort of hide in a silo of single religious community. There are very few places left in America that are really that homogeneous. And so I do feel this is something we all need to engage with. In terms of deep faith, again, I would say understand that these families who are doing both, educating their children in both, claiming both, are families that care about religion. These are families, even if both parents are secular, they care enough about religion that they want their children to be educated, to be religiously literate. And so I would hope that somebody who has, you know, a very deep, committed faith to one religion would appreciate that these are families who are also committed to the idea of religion as being something that can be a positive force in the world. Because there's also a lot of rhetoric that it's not. And at times, of course, it isn't positive, but that there's a potential for it to be a positive force. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be teaching my children two religious systems. So is that helpful?
Well, I think that's, I mean, questions are raised in my mind is what's the difference between belief and what's the difference and what's the value of then religious traditions. And I think that, I mean, again, I mean, from my own personal context, being from a small town in rural Kansas, the religious diversity there was, you know, it was very small. And so I think that it seems to me that there is a horizon in the work and in the conversations that you all are doing that, again, shows that this is, one, not only a topic that we can ignore, but that we ought not to ignore it, even if the demographics sort of force it upon us. The point is that this is important as a community, and so it seems like that seems to be you know, the real heart of this, is that it gives great life, that it is something.
Yes.
And that,
go ahead.
No, sorry, please, go ahead.
The equation of religion and belief it's a very Christian way of looking at the world. Mm-hmm. in Judaism, you have this tremendous diversity of belief, and it's really more about the practice. And of course, the same is true in Buddhism. It's really not about the beliefs, it's about the practice. Karen Armstrong, of course, writes about this. So I think the idea that each religion has a singular belief that it's connected to, and therefore you can't have more than one, is something that I would reject. That said, if you have deep belief in one religion and you want to choose it, that's wonderful. Mazel tov. But more and more of us aren't making that choice. And what I see in the young adults and teens that I interviewed who had this interfaith education is that a lot of them, at least at this young age, and most of them were still in their 20s, saw more advantage to continuing to claim both family religions than they saw to choosing one. Now, some of them talked about the possibility of choosing one someday in conjunction with a spouse. So it's not that they felt torn between the two parents and was deciding between the two parents. It's that they thought, well, maybe when I get married, we'll decide on one religion. And at least they have background in both so that they can make a more, they have a head start in joining a religion with a potential spouse. But I'm not sure if that's really the way it will play out. Somebody really needs to do longitudinal studies on these children and see how they end up. But for now, I'm just very reassured that they feel whole and happy and engaged. They're not apathetic. They're not confused. I don't think we've wrecked our kids by doing this.
And I would just add, too, I think the important thing to remember is that when you're raising children in an interfaith sort of community or type organization or at home or wherever, it's not a matter of just combining these two faiths and creating this gray faith. I think it's really a lifting up of whether it's 2 or 3 or 4, whatever amount of faiths that there are existing in the home, really giving sort of an authentic understanding of each of those faiths. And that's why when you talk about the interfaith education, there's a Jewish educator and a Christian educator for the Jewish Christian sort of organizations. So there's no sort of confusion that I'm living in this sort of ambiguousness, but I'm lifting up these different faiths because they mean something to me. So they're sacred in their differences, and they're sacred also in those points of intersection too. So that's something I think that to remember.
Yes. You need to write your experience. I want to read your book.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. I don't want to have the last word, so if there's any other questions or comments, I don't know. Well, I would just... Yeah, please, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just appreciate the conversation very much, and I hope that it's the first of many conversations, with people sort of, telling their story and hearing more about your story, Susan, of course. But I really thank you for this, and it's just nice to kind of give voice to a lot of people's experience that, like you're saying, is often not heard. So it was really a pleasure.
Thank you, and I appreciate Religions for Peace making space for this conversation. It's really a pioneering area, and I look forward to working together on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks to you both, Susan and Sam. This is a wonderful conversation, and I want to ask Susan if you would. What we'll be able to do then is on the Religions for Peace USA website, we'll provide some of the links and the resources to the organizations that you've profiled in your book, and also a link to your book too as well. So for all the viewers who are interested in sort of, again, go out and read her book and sort of connect with the organizations, and let's keep on moving this work. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.